Listen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce John Jerrim, Gill Wyness, to set the scene from a research perspective. Gill is a research officer at the Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics, which we have over the years given a lot of work to, as you know, and where she specialises in higher education access and information. Her current work is on the cost of higher education, and of course is very relevant to our discussions over these 2 days. Dr. John Jerrim lectures in economics and social statistics at the Institute of Education and was described as the most promising PhD student in the quantitative social sciences. He's since won the Economic and Social Research Council Early Career Outstanding Impact Award. So let's hope you can keep it up, John, but that's all very impressive.
You're putting the pressure on here,
so
aren't you?
So anyway, over to you. I think you're going to kick off, right, John?
Thank you so much, Sir Peter, for such a grand introduction. So, like I was just said, I'm a lecturer at the Institute of Education in Economics and Social Statistics. Most of my work focuses on cross-national comparisons, particularly of educational achievements using data sets like PISA, but also of higher education across countries, which I'm going to be speaking about a little bit here today. And then Jill's going to follow a little bit more with specifics about the UK institutions. Not quite sure what to do now. There we go.
I'm going to go. I can't see this.
Technology always fails me. So I'm going to cover 3 key topics in my segment of this talk. The first is, why do we care about access to elite institutions? Why is this not a summit about higher education in general? Why do we care if people go to universities like Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, and the like? I'm then going to talk about, well, how big is the problem? By the problem, I mean the socioeconomic gap in elite university access. Then, thirdly and finally, I don't think you can come to a summit like this without discussing issues around costs, fees, debts, and loans. So I'm going to touch on that before Jill says a little bit as well. Okay, so let's start with my first question. Why do we care? Why do we care about access to high-status institutions? Again, drawing on my background from economics, we would instantly start thinking about returns and labour market returns and how much are these degrees, inverted commas, worth. And Dr. Cable was alluding to the graduate premium that young people who go to university in general earn roughly £100,000 more than those who do not. However, there's a literature in both the United States and the United Kingdom that suggests going to an elite institution, you get a higher economic reward. So there's a financial reward to university quality. And if we take a student going to an average institution, 50th percentile of the quality, very much on average, and then move them up to something like the 85th percentile, so the top 15% institution, there's a return of roughly 6% in their yearly earnings. And that holds for both the United States and the United Kingdom. This isn't to say that this is just earnings, the raw gap. This is once we've taken into account the differences in the composition of these 2 types of institutions, so controlling for family background, prior academic achievement, and the like. So it's an additional return on top to university quality. And of course, it's not just about financial rewards or financial returns to going to these high-status institutions. Obtaining a qualification from an elite university is almost a prerequisite now for certain occupations. The medical schools to become a doctor are mostly found within our elite universities. The top law recruiters hire from the elite universities, as does the City of London. And I've picked here one extreme example, becoming the UK Prime Minister as an occupation. And this shows all our post-war Prime Ministers and whether they went to university or not, and if they went to university, which one. And you can see here that actually if you go to university, you need to go really to the University of Oxford to become the British Prime Minister. Unless you're Gordon Brown. Okay, so that's why we should be why we should care about our elite institutions. I will say one more actually on top that's not in my slides, is that we should be proud of our elite institutions, both in the UK and the United States. Whenever world rankings of universities come out, our institutions are always found near the top. And so we should have pride in our institutions, and we should celebrate the fact that they are world leading. However, we know that there's a socioeconomic gap in who attends these institutions. So how big is this problem? This is from some of my own research looking at the social composition of elite institutions by household income. Elite, in this definition, I've used the Barron Index, which is a well-known marker in the United States, and the Sutton Trust 13 institutions for England. The green portion of these bars are the percent of the undergraduate population who come from low-income backgrounds, with low income defined here as the bottom 25% of the household income distribution. And as you can see, it's small. It's roughly about 5% in these two countries. The red portion of the bars is the middle 50%, who quite clearly fare a lot better. However, when you take the bottom 25% and the middle 50% combined, they still make up roughly less than half of the undergraduate population. It's clearly the most advantaged group, the top 25% of the income distribution, that dominates, with over 50% of the undergraduate population represented. Of course, we can not only look at universities' groups, but depending on the indicators we use, the measure of family background, we can also look at specific institutions. So this comes from Higher Education and Statistics Authority data for the UK, where we look at certain universities, the percentage of the undergraduate population coming from state schools or coming from lower occupations. Towards the bottom, we have some of our more elite institutions, Warwick, LSE, Imperial, Cambridge and Oxford, where there's about 60% from state schools, or 40%, therefore, from private or independent schools. This, like Sir Peter was saying, is despite private schools educating just 7% of our population. So they're disproportionately represented in our elite universities. You can compare this with other institutions. I'm going to have to be careful how I phrase other institutions. Less prestigious than the top leading Russell Group. And I've taken just some random examples here, Bolton, Greenwich and Roehampton, where almost everyone is from a state school background at these universities. So there are clear differences and this clear segregation within our university system. And you can do the same kind of analysis using a different marker for the United States. This is from IPED's data, and it's the social composition of specific US universities by Pell Grant recipients. Pell Grant, again, as a proxy for disadvantaged background. And if you look at MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Michigan, Yale, it's roughly about 1 in 5 who are eligible for the Pell Grant, where if you compare this to, again, perhaps some less prestigious institutions, Alcorn State and Columbia Southern, it's more than half. So these are big, big differences. And of course, you can stand here and say, yes, we know this, but isn't this just about what goes on in school? Isn't this just about prior academic achievement? And again, Dr. Cable was questioning, well, when's the best time to invest in our young people? And it's important to remember that academic ability is a major driver, probably the one single biggest driver of this socio-economic difference. And we should not stop our determination to raise disadvantaged young people's academic achievement. And that's probably where the focus of government policy should be. It's probably the most economically efficient place to invest and potentially the most equitable as well. However, having said that, it doesn't explain everything. So here, again, drawing from my own work, I look at the socio-economic gap, the difference between working class and professional children of going to an elite higher education institution relative to going to another institution or a different institution. And the total length of these bars is the overall socioeconomic gap, the overall difference in the chances of going to one of these universities. The black portion of the bar is what can be explained by what happens earlier, by what can be explained by their school grades. Whereas the grey portion of the bar is what's left unexplained due to other factors, not necessarily higher education finance, but various things such as aspirations, whether they think they'll fit in. There's several explanations. It's just unexplained by prior academic achievement. And although you can see the black bars are large, like I said, probably where our major or main effort should be, we shouldn't forget that it can't explain everything, and there's still a gap left that we can target with later interventions. Finally, the cost of higher education in the two countries. You can't do a summit like this without talking about cost, although, as I said, it's not the only factor likely to be at play. And in the US, I think there's been discussions for a while about differences between sticker prices and net prices. Sticker prices is, okay, what's the total cost of, or the headline figure you see of going to this university, taking into account all the possible costs you could pay. And the values are very, very large. At Harvard, you'd be talking about £37,000 per year. And at Oxford, you'd be talking about £16,000 per year. So these are big, big figures and could obviously disadvantage young people off. However, we need to think about the net cost, so taking out scholarships, bursaries, and the like, and how that varies by family background. One of the difficulties with this, with trying to compare the UK and the US as I've done here, is that our systems of finance are very different. In the UK, we've got income contingent loans, and to take that into account is tricky. We've also got various other discrepancies between the two countries, but some comparisons can attempt to be made. And of course, one of the key differences that I haven't shown here is that in the United States, a typical bachelor's degree lasts 4 years, whereas in the UK, it typically lasts 3 years. And although we often think about costs, I was having someone say 4 years, but...
4 years in Scotland.
Oh, in Scotland. Okay, sorry. Okay, I stand corrected on that point. But with some universities still offering 3-year degrees, then that's 1 year where they can earn in the labour market, whereas in the United States they can't. So we've got opportunity costs as well, foregone income that we need to consider. So these comparisons across country are often more tricky than we might initially think. But at that point, I'm going to pass over to Jill.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm going to take a little bit of a step back in my presentation and talk about a quite fundamental issue, which is what do students actually know about the costs and benefits of going to university? And I'm drawing on work that we have done at the London School of Economics, myself and Professor Sandra McNally, where we actually interviewed 15-year-olds, so children at school, in a quite a key time for them in terms of decision making about whether to go to university or not. So we interviewed 15-year-olds and we asked them what they understood about the current HE finance system. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So before I get into what students actually understand, I wanted to provide a little bit of context. Now I know most people in the room will probably understand that, and the business secretary went through it himself, but just to sort of recap, obviously we had a very major set of reforms in 2012, and the most notable of which was that the tuition fee cap rose from £3,000 to £9,000 per year. So a big increase in costs across the board for all students. But of course, tuition fees aren't paid up front. No one pays anything up front. They're paid after graduation when students have got a job. And loan repayment is 9% of earnings above 21,000. It used to be 15,000. So you can already sort of see at this point that it is kind of complicated when students are trying to work out how much it's going to cost them to go to university. They have to bear in mind, they have to know what they're going to earn in the future, and they have to make this calculation that it's 9% of their earnings. A further complication was added in 2012, which was that interest rates were put onto loans. So loans used to be interest-free. Now there's an interest rate. It varies between 0 and 3%, depending on what you earn as a graduate. So that's another complication that students have to bear in mind. They'd have to predict their income, and then they'd have to add on this interest rate, which varies according to their income as well, in order to understand what they might pay to go to university. So in summary, some graduates will be better off actually under the new system. Most will pay more. But what's very clear from this is that the system has become much more complicated. So with that in mind, it's very important that we explain to students, and that students can weigh up the costs and benefits of going to university. So as I said, it's more difficult now for pupils when they're making a decision about whether to go to university or not, to work out how much it's going to cost them. And given the increase in costs, it's also more important for them to work out the full picture. So what are the benefits of going to university? Which university should they go to, and which subject should they choose? These are very important factors. What return are they going to get on this investment in terms of their wages, but also in terms of their future happiness, well-being, etc. And as I think has been talked about already today, a big problem we've got in this country is that information, advice and guidance in schools is quite patchy. And that's led to a real lack of understanding, particularly among pupils of state schools, as to how much this system costs them and how much they're going to benefit from it. And that's what I'm really going to cover today. So I'm going to start off with a very basic question that we asked these 15-year-olds. We asked how much they thought it costs in terms of tuition fees per year to go to university. Now, actually, this is quite an encouraging slide. So this shows the distribution of their responses. And there's a big spike, as you can see, at £9,000. So lots and lots of 15-year-olds were able to say, yes, it's £9,000, I get that. You can see, actually, that there are a fair amount who under and overestimate how much it's going to cost them. But largely, this is a reasonably encouraging picture that students from both independent and state schools, which I've split here in the picture, seem to have quite a good understanding of that headline figure. But what happens when we look beyond the headlines and we look at the finer details of our system? So first of all, we asked students from state and independent schools whether they thought that they were eligible for help with finances. Now, of course, everyone is eligible for help. Everyone has access to a tuition fee loan, a maintenance loan, and some students have access to grants. But actually, what's quite disturbing here is that only 50% of state school students and slightly more from independent schools were aware that they could get help with their finances. Another worrying finding, and I think this is one of the most worrying, as I've just pointed out, tuition fees are paid after students graduate and get a job. I mean, that's a fundamental aspect of the government's policy on tuition fees. You don't pay up front. It's fair for everybody because you only repay after you've graduated. But less than half of 15-year-olds that we talked to actually knew that that was the case. They didn't understand that you don't pay fees until after you graduate. So given that quite disturbing finding, it's probably not surprising that a large proportion of students are put off applying to university because of the cost. And you can see here actually that this is where one of the gaps emerges. State and independent school students are sort of equally ignorant about the system up to now. But looking at the proportion that might be put off because of the cost, you can see that it is 10 percentage points higher for state school pupils. Now, bearing in mind that the government gives everybody equal access to loans, tuition fee loans and maintenance loans and grants, there shouldn't really be any reason for a disparity in terms of being put off to university because of the cost. And yet you can see here that there clearly is. The other thing we talk to students about is about the benefits of HE. It's not just about the cost, it's about what you think you're going to get out of this degree if you take it on. So we asked about the benefits of higher education as well. And again, in terms of the very basic understanding of this, the headline figures, most people understand that you'll get a better job if you stay on at school and you'll get a better job if you go to university. That's what university is for. You'll get a better job out of it. And you can see there are some gaps here, but largely it's quite well understood. this sort of pretty basic headline question was very well understood. Again, if we drill down a little bit deeper and go into a more specific element of it, how much better off will you be if you go to university? You know you're going to get a better job, you know you're going to earn more. How much more? So this chart here shows the ratio of graduate earnings to A-level earnings. So how much more do you believe you will earn if you have a degree versus if you leave school at 18 with A-levels? Is it 2 times as much, 3 times as much? Now, the true ratio is around about, well, it varies depending on which research you look at, but it's somewhere between 1.4 and 1.8 times as much. And actually, you can see, interestingly, there is a big spike there. So a lot of 15-year-olds are actually quite able to estimate that. But what's actually very disturbing is this incredibly long tail here, which I had to cut off at 28 times. Actually, probably need another screen here to show it to you. So yeah, I mean, if you sort of cut it off at the part where you think people are starting to just fool around, then as many as 53% of students believe that they will earn over 2 times as much as with a degree as with A-levels. And you can see that many, many more massively overestimate that. You know, maybe we should be optimistic about that, because people are going to go to university if they think it's going to give them that kind of a return. But obviously what we want, bearing in mind the increased costs of going to university, we want people to actually understand the true benefit of going, the true financial benefit of it. And particularly if, in order to work out how much you're going to pay back in terms of fees, you need to know how much you're going to earn, then it's very important to have some understanding of this. So I think this is pretty worrying too. Excuse me. Finally, we asked students a slightly more nuanced question, which is what are the differences between universities and courses that you might do. Now, obviously, this is very relevant to today's summit, looking at the returns to elite institutions. So we asked students whether they thought the course that they would choose, the subject that they would study, would matter for their future earnings. And you can see, actually, I think quite a worrying statistic, which is that 47% of state school students didn't think it made any difference which subject they chose. They would earn about the same. And actually, you can see there's a big gap here. So students from independent schools were better versed on that. They understood that certain subjects are likely to give you a better return in the labour market than others. And that was really not very well understood by state school students. And I think this is also a very worrying finding, which is that 60% of state school students believe that no matter what institution they go to, they'll earn the same. So they didn't see that there would be any difference in wages if they went to, you know, Oxford versus Roehampton, as you mentioned before. And again, you can see that whilst independent school students are still slightly ignorant of that fact, there is, you know, quite a big gap in understanding here. So the independent school students are getting more knowledge on this than state school students. So, you know, it just makes you think, how can we really expect great numbers of state school students to choose an elite institution if they don't understand what the benefit of that institution is? They think all institutions are pretty much the same. So there we are. That's all I'm going to talk about today. So we've uncovered fairly poor knowledge of actually quite basic aspects of the HE finance system. And we also found that whilst there were fairly good understanding of headlines, like how much tuition fees are, once you go beyond those headlines and you look at the slightly more nuanced aspects of our system, knowledge becomes poorer, and the gap in knowledge between state school and independent school students seems to widen. Okay, that's all from me. We didn't rehearse that. little walk there, did we?
The change.
Well, thank you. I thought those were 2 really interesting presentations. We're going to take questions. I'm just going to make just a point about your presentation, Gill. You said that there was 0 interest rate and now there's 3. What there is there's RPI, which is running at 3.5%. So the interest rate on loans before 2012 were compounding at 3.5%. they are now compounding at 6.5%, which I think is a pretty healthy rate of compound, of compound growth. So just to clarify that point, it wasn't 0 and 3, it's 3.5 and 6.
Zero real, I guess I meant.
Zero
Take your
real,
point
but I mean,
completely,
yeah, but if you're paying a loan back,
Yeah, no,
it's what it is.
absolutely.
It's not real. It's real. But listen, do you want to take sort of 3 questions at a time? Shall we do that?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to take 3 questions and then we'll take answers from here. So, who would like to ask a question?
John, I think it's mainly a question for you. You put up the charts showing the unexplained gap in elite participation, UK and US, and the gap in the UK was smaller. You also showed the charts of the net costs of Oxford and Harvard, showing Harvard being a lot cheaper. I just wonder how you interpret that in terms of those cost figures being how much of those differences they're explaining, given that difference from the UK and the US.
So if I understand your...
Let's ask another question. Yeah. Do you want to clarify the question? Or?
No.
That's all right. Let's have another question. There you go. Great.
Thanks. Steve Jones, University of Manchester. And just as a follow-on to that question, it's great that you've been able to quantify this unexplained bit. I wonder whether you think it's at all related to the admissions procedure that UK's universities use, particularly with evidence that non-academic indicators like interviews, personal statements, teachers' references may actually benefit some applicants over others.
Right. We've got a question right here.
So, Alan West, Imperial College.
Right.
I wonder if you found any correlation between subject shortage, in particular for STEM teachers, and the kind of choices that students are making, and whether that impacts on your data.
John, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I
And
think
then
I'll deal
we'll,
with the
Jill
first 2
talk.
questions. I might come back to
Right.
that one. So I thought this situation would arise and I would get asked to explain the unexplained gap that's left. And I mean, the purpose of that piece of research that we did was to look at academic achievement and specifically the role of that. And like I said,
just to explain, what did you use for the US and the what was the how do you define academic achievement?
academic achievement. Okay, so academic achievement in the UK was a proxy PISA test score, PISA being a big international assessment, A-level grades and GCSE grades, and we conditioned on whether they'd finished education up to 18 as well. Kind of the empirical
So it
strategy.
was a mix of
It was a
basket
mix
of things.
Yeah, so
Right.
the strategy was to try and take into account everything we possibly could. So equivalently in the US, we used SAT quintile, so
Yep.
fifth of the distribution. We used a cognitive maths test sat at 16 and at 18. We took in grade point average between grades 9 and 12. And there was some other things in there, conditional
right.
high school completion.
So it's not a simple answer then.
It's not a simple answer, but
All right, fine.
well, the simple
Sorry, I
answer.
asked.
The simple answer would be we
Yeah,
tried to
okay.
control for everything
All
we
right,
can
fine,
possibly
okay.
observe.
All right, fine.
Possible.
I'm sure you got it right. Okay.
So coming back to the question,
Right.
they're both credible explanations. How much do I believe is down to costs? Certainly not everything, but it's difficult to put a figure on what exactly that proportion would be. The same with the actual application process. It's difficult to actually quantify it. But if I was to say, I think it's more to do with the fact that kids probably aren't applying rather than that they're applying and not being let in by the universities. That's my reaction from seeing other research by people from the Institute of Education.
Do you want to try and answer Steve's question?
Could you repeat your
No,
question?
Steve, no, we got
Oh.
a question about other factors other than academic, personal statements. Steve did some research for us on this, which was very interesting and got a lot of coverage. But he's talking about, do you think the fact that, you know, better heeled kids have better personal statements, have done a lot more and all that stuff, how big a factor is that in your opinion? I mean, that's his question.
So I can give you an opinion, but I can't give you quantitative evidence on it. And I think it probably has some influence. I don't think it has a particularly big influence on what's left to be explained.
Right.
But,
Okay.
you know, it's an opinion rather than kind of an empirical fact.
Then we had a question about STEM. Yeah.
Yes, I was picking up on the fact that you were talking about subject matter and the students' appreciation of that and the variation between the maintained and the independent sector. But I just wonder if there's any correlation between that and the shortage that exists within the maintained sector of subject specialist teachers of STEM.
Again, I think if you say pretty robustly, pretty surely, there is a correlation. So STEM graduates earn more. There's big competing demand for their skills, and so they get attracted particularly to high status, I don't want to say high status professions, but particular other professions, and draws them out potentially from going down the teaching route. So I think that that's an issue. There's high returns to STEM subjects and they get attracted to other careers.
I'm
Gill.
not thinking so much about the recruitment of teachers in the first instance, but whether teachers without that specialist knowledge would actually have an impact on the kind of decisions that students make about higher education pathways.
I mean, I haven't looked into this myself, so I don't think I'm going to be able to.
Jill, do you have any thoughts on those questions? Do you have anything to add to what John said? Any additional thoughts?
No, it's interesting actually, the question about personal statements. People keep bringing that up now, so I think we really need to do some research into it. But I suspect maybe
University of Manchester has already done it, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
My understanding was that the general consensus was that nobody reads them, but I don't know if that's definitely true or not. So I
Okay, shall we take some more questions?
need to do some research.
Look at all the hands now.
Over here.
What did I do?
We are.
Carol Torgerson from Durham University. It's a question for Jill. You mentioned in your biography that you've just recently undertaken a randomised evaluation of information, advice and guidance. I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about what the intervention was and what the control condition was and what the outcomes were from that trial. Thanks.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, just a minute. We're going to just take three and then let you answer. That's all right. What about right here at the front?
Sorry, I'll give you
That's right.
Hi, Penelope Griffin from the University of Nottingham. It's just really a point of clarification. I wonder, Jill, were you taking into account when assessing whether the new fee system was better or worse for low-income students, the 30-year safety net, so the fact that loans are written off after 30 years if not repaid then?
Okay. What about one over there? Yeah.
Simon Willis, University of York. I think this is for Jill. Jill, on your slides, it indicated that the research with 15-year-olds might have been done in 2010-11. Is that right? I wondered whether there's any evidence emerging in the post-KISS environment of better informed prospective students.
Yeah, I think that is a very good question because your research is kind of before the new fees came in. Just a personal thing, you know, I chair this thing called the Education Endowment Foundation, which is helping kids in the most challenging schools. Every time I go into school, I get the kids around the table and I ask them what do they want to be when they grow up, and I ask them about university. And actually, in the 2.5 years I've been doing this, there's been a real change. Kids now say we don't have to worry about student tuition fees because we pay them back when we work, which is not, I don't personally agree with that. But that's what I think the government campaign to, you know, bring that across is actually work. Just my empirical observation. But why don't you? All these questions are for you, so why don't you go ahead this time?
Yeah, well, they're all related actually. So the first question about our intervention that I mentioned in the biography, So these slides that I presented were taken from that actual experiment, and these were the baseline statistics, looking at what knowledge students had at the baseline. And then what we did was we randomly, between schools, we gave some schools a sort of information pack about things like the fact that you don't pay tuition fees till after you graduate, and interest rates and those kinds of things. So we gave lots of information. It was largely delivered by teachers. We tried to deliver it online and encourage students to look at our website, but none of them did. We emailed them with a link and said, this will be great, have a look, and no one did. So we had to go back on that, and we delivered it in schools. So that was a lesson.
I might jump in there, because
Yeah,
I've just been discussing a project with some colleagues of mine in Ann Arbor who've been running kind of a similar experiment, but using smartphones and kind of texting information and texting link to the pupils. And they worked out it cost about $7, about I think £4 or £5 per pupil to kind of send these texts repeatedly. And then they could click on the links and go find information about the application process and about higher education fees. And they found it did have an impact on, I think it was knowledge, but also whether they applied and what type of university they went to. So there's evidence from the States developing on that as well.
And so, we ended up delivering it in schools via lesson sort of plans and things like that. And at the same time as the intervention, which goes back to the other question about when this took place, it was very much around the time when the government announced that the fee increase was about to happen. So there was a huge media storm around that time as well. And just because of the timing of when we did the experiment and we did the intervention at different times, we were able to look at both effects of the information campaign that we delivered, but also the massive amount of media attention that went on at the same time. And we found it was interesting that there was a huge impact from the media in terms of people's understanding, but that was primarily of costs. So the media campaign very much focused on the cost of HE. So there was a huge improvement in students' understanding of how much it costs to go to university because of the media campaign. But there was no improvement from the media in terms of how much students understood about the benefits of going to HE. People who were more exposed to media were more likely to say it costs more and I'm less likely to go because of it. Whereas if you looked at the students that we gave our information campaign to, they were more likely to say it costs more, but they were also more likely to say, I understand the benefits more, I understand that I'll get a good job, and I also understand that I don't have to pay it up front, and those kinds of things. So we found that basically you can outweigh the cost, the damaging cost of the media, with a quite light touch information campaign. But I think the other really important conclusion to draw from that is that you can really harness the media if you get it right. If you get the media on your side, then they will have a huge impact. And unfortunately, they weren't on the side of the whole, of giving all the information to students. They just wanted to give the debt information.
Yeah.
But if they had managed to, deliver
the benefits as well,
then that might have been really good. The other question was about when the research took place, and I think I've sort of covered that. So it was at a time where it was all in the media, and so we were just learning about the new system. We haven't updated it, so we don't know how much that's changed between then and now. I know the government have done various things like sending people into schools and all those kinds of things. Yeah, it would be really useful to actually know whether that works or not, because I think there's mixed evidence on that.
Right.
I think there was one more question about whether I said something about whether students were better or worse off under the new system. That was just some research that was taken from the IFS, actually. So I mean, we didn't tell students that they would be better or worse off. I was just saying that some graduates will be better off if they never earn more than £21,000 a year. I mean, that was all I was saying from that, but that's from the IFS.
Let's just, we're due to go to coffee, we're running a little. Let's just take two more questions and then we'll break for coffee. So two more, one at the back there. Mike from Oxford, yeah.
Mike Nicholson, University of Oxford. This is a question for John. John, in your assessment of the differences between US, UK universities, any attempt made at all on subject choice? And I say that because obviously in the US, most students will go and do a liberal arts degree. They may not declare a major 2 years into the course. UK universities, candidates generally selecting quite early on about what they want to go and study. But probably more importantly, in the elite universities, there'll be many degree courses that students might want to do who perform well that those universities don't offer. A good example is something like physiotherapy, where, you know, very competitive to get into, but very few elite universities would offer that as an option.
And Wendy, please.
Well, my question is very similar, actually, coincidentally to mine. It's about subject choice, and really goes back to the question from our biz colleague here. Did you think of taking into account, when you were determining the proportion of prior attainment as a key factor for working class kids to go to university, did you think of taking into account subject choice and the subject combination, both in terms of the A levels that they have and the subject that they're choosing at university, because that makes a huge difference. So it goes back to what Vince was saying, actually. It's all very well perhaps getting top grades, but if they're not in the right subjects for the course you're applying for, then you do have a problem.
Certainly, and I think that that's an incredibly valid point, saying that actually you've got this trade-off between subject and institution, and we do say in the piece of research that we've done that, you know, you might go to do a more prestigious subject at a less prestigious institution, and that might be a better decision than going the other way around. We weren't able to take it into account in what we were doing because, you know, trying to get stuff that's comparable across Australia, England and the United States is tricky enough with just institution and prior grades. We didn't go then to try and go to the added complexity of subjects. For the kind of when we controlled for achievement, we did take into account, we did do controls for kind of what A-level subjects they were. It didn't dramatically change from what I presented here today. So I think it's a good point, but we didn't specifically look into subject. On the first question, again, I didn't look into differences between subjects, and you're right, there is differences across countries, and it's just this obvious difference in our system that the US don't pick a major until they're partway through the course, where we specify up front. So I'm certain that will have a bearing on all types of things, but we haven't specifically considered it here. Whether it would kind of change the overall message, I very much, I don't think it would.
Gill, do you have any comments on that?
Well, yeah, actually in the piece of research that we did, we looked at what students' subjects that they were choosing. This was at GCSE actually, but then we also asked them what they might do at university. And then we gave some students information about the different returns and the different jobs that you could get for different subjects. And actually we just found it had no impact. It just seemed it's very difficult to budge students in terms of the subjects that they like and that they think they're good at and what they want to do, and to actually budge them in any way, we didn't see any response at all from any kind of information. It's like you're on a path from quite an early age about what you think you're good at and what you're going to do.
And I've done previous research actually that's very much in line with that. It's people who do certain subjects do kind of have realistic ideas about what they're going to earn, but people who enter other subjects, mainly the humanities and education, they tend to overestimate. So, no.
Okay, thank you. Listen, our next session is entitled "What Works in Improving Outreach." It's going to start at 11:45, and will be chaired by James Turner, who's our Director of Programmes. After lunch, we have Les Ebden, Director of Offer, delivering a keynote address, and Connor Ryan, who's our Director of Research and Communications, will then chair a panel on the discussion on higher education affordability. So please, if you could be back here in 25 minutes at 11:45. I think these guys done a great job, I really do. So let's give them a big hand.